Okay, hi everybody. This is our review for our second brachot test of the year, which is really supposed to be our third. We will begin with Unit 6, the unit which discusses tasting food on a fast day. Okay, we're actually going to translate this in parts, so we're going to start off with the Gemara's question. Ba'amine ashian tana debei Rav Ami Rav Ami. Ashian is the person's name. Tana, who was a Tana, debei Rabbi Ami in the yeshiva in the school of Rabbi Ami, me Rav Ami. He asked a question from Rabbi Ami. The phrase ba'amine, which you need to know for the test, make sure that you know that it always precedes a question. It literally means he asked from him. Whenever you see the phrase ba'amine, you know it's going to precede who's asking from who. So again, ba'amine, he asked from him who? Ashian, who was a Tana, a student in the school of Rabbi Ami, asked from Rabbi Ami the following question. Here's the question: someone who's involved in fasting, what is the halacha in terms of tasting? Instead of you taste the food and you spit it out. The next important phrase you need to know is going to be on the test is the phrase mahu. Mahu means what about, which literally is asking what's the halacha? What's the halacha in terms of fasting? That's what you want to know. On a fast day, can you put food in your mouth and then spit it out? Now the Gemara goes on to explain the two possible ways of answering this question. The first one is achila ushtia kabialeha. Did the person who's fasting achila ushtia kabialeha accept upon themselves not to eat or drink? The haleka, and this is not that. I mean, this is not a problem of eating or drinking because in this case you're spitting out the food. O dilma, or maybe, and here's the third important term you need to know. O dilma means or maybe. O dilma always separates between two possible ways of thinking. So the first possible way of thinking again, achila ushtia kabiyaleh b'haleka, did he accept upon himself? Kabbalah, did he accept upon himself achila ushtia, not to eat or drink b'haleka? And this is not that, you're just tasting. O dilma, or maybe hana'a kibiyaleha. He accepted upon himself hana'a, not physically benefiting from food, the ha'ika, and this is. So which one is right? This is benefiting from food. You taste food in your mouth, it tastes good. You benefit in some way from the food. And therefore, if that's what's the problem on a fast day, that would not be allowed. So what is the answer? So the answer that Rav Ami gave, Amar Le, he said to him, Rav Ami responded, Toim, he could taste ve'ein bekach klum, and it's not a problem. One more time from the top. Ba'amine Ashian tanad be Rav Ami Rav Ami. Ashian, who was a Tana in the house of Rav Ami, asked from Rabbi Ami, Hasharoi b'tanit, when someone who's involved in a fast, Mahu, what's the halacha sheyato in terms of tasting? Achila ushtia kabial, did he accept upon himself not to eat or drink? V'halakam, this is not that. This therefore would be fine. This is not eating and drinking. It's tasting. O dilma, or maybe hanakil, he accepted upon himself not to benefit from the food. V'haikam, this is that, and this is benefiting from the food, which would be a problem. Amar he responded, Toim, he could taste ve'ein b'kachlim without a problem. Okay, now that we have that first part in our back pocket, let's move on. The Gemara then says the phrase Tanya nami hachi. Tanya means it's in a braita, taught in a braita. Nami also hachi, like this. Okay, it was also taught like this in a braita. Okay, that is always an introduction to a braita, which is going to prove something that we had just said. So Tanya nami hachi. Here's a braita that teaches just the same exact halakha. And here's the braita. Mita'amet, someone who tastes food, eina te'una bracha, does not require bracha. V'hasharoi b'tanit, and someone who is involved in fasting, toim can taste, ve'ein b'kachlam, and it's not a problem. Right? Almost quoting verbatim what Rav Ami said about a fast day. To'im ve'ein b'kachlam, he could taste, and it's not a problem. In this case, the braita also includes the fact that you can taste. If you taste food and spit it out, it does not require a bracha as well, because a bracha you make on actually consuming food, and this is not consuming food, right? It's not eating or drinking, like we said earlier, and that's equated to someone who's fasting. So the same way that you don't make a bracha for spitting out food, you also don't make a bracha if you are involved in fasting. And I'm sorry, if you don't make a bracha, you're allowed to spit out food if you are involved in fasting, because the same way when it comes to a bracha, it's not considered to be achila, eating. So too when it comes to a fast day, it's not considered to be achila, it's not considered to be eating. And a fast day, the only problem is eating and drinking. So now let's read it from the top one more time. Ashian, who was a student in the school of Rabbi Ami, asked from Rabbi Ami. Hashari b'tanit, someone involved in fasting. Mahu, what's the halacha? Sheyatom, in terms of tasting. Achila ushtia kabiyah halal, did he accept upon himself not to eat or drink v'halachem? This is not a problem with that because it's only tasting, spitting the food out. O dilma, or maybe hana kibah, he accepted upon himself not to benefit from the food v'haikam. This is benefit. You taste it, you enjoy it, and that's problematic. Amar le toim imekachlum. Rabbi Ami responded, you could taste without a problem. Tani Nami Hachin, there's a brighta just like this. Mitamet Eina Tuna Bracha. The brighta says that someone who tastes food and spits it out does not require to make a bracha beforehand, so it's not considered to be eating. Also, the Hasharoi B'Tani, it's someone who's involved in fasting, Toin can taste Ve'im Kachlam, and it's not a problem. The Gemara now goes on to ask, Ad Kama, how much can a person taste? The Gemara answers, Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Asi, Ta'ameh ad shiur reviyata. Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi would taste food on a fast day up until a reviyat. A reviyat is a significant measurement of food. I'm not going to get into the specifics of how you measure it, but it's a significant amount in terms of halacha. The best example for that is in terms of kiddush, things like kiddush, havdalah, using the 4 cups on Pesach, all require at least a reviyat of wine. So what we're seeing here is even up to a reviyat of wine, a significant amount of wine. Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, people saw them notice that they would taste the food on a fast day. They didn't have a problem with it. So that's telling us even up to a significant amount of food, you would be allowed to taste on a fast day and spit out. Again, so let's read the entire. So again, the Gemara says, Ba'amine Ashian Tanad Rav Ami. Rav Ami, sorry to repeat myself over and over again, right? But Ashian, who's a student in the house of Rav Ami, asked Rav Ami, Hashar B'Tanit, someone involved in a fast. Ma, what's the halacha? Shiyatam, can they taste about tasting the food? Achilu Shtia Kabbalah, did they accept upon themselves not to eat or drink? B'halekam, this is not that, and it's therefore would be fine. O Dilmor, maybe Hanakiwaled, they accepted upon themselves not to benefit from the food. Ha'ikam, that is benefiting, that's a problem. Amrullah, he responded, To'ain B'Kates Ve'im Klachum, it's not a problem. Tani Nami Hachin, there's a bright that's just like that, and what does the bright to say? Mitamemet Ein to a bracha, someone who tastes food does not require bracha. Hasharoi b'tanit, someone who's fasting, can taste food and it's not a problem. Again, a perfect proof for what we just said. The Gemara then has one more question. Ad kama, up until how much? Rav Ami Ravasi, Tami ad shir reviyata. Rabbi Ami Ravasi tasted even up to a reviyat, a significant amount, telling us that even that amount would be permitted to taste on a fast day. We also saw a comment from Rashi and a comment from Tosfot, which taught us a little bit about how to learn Rishonim on Gemara. Again, Rashi and Tosfot are Rishonim, coming from the first period of those great rabbis who gave commentary on the Gemara. Rashi normally gives a running commentary. So Rashi, we see at the top of the page, is the following. When the Gemara says, Mahu sheyatum, when the Gemara asks, what's the halacha in terms of tasting? So Rashi gives an example of tasting. Eratav shil, tasting the food. Ladat, to know, im tzarich melchav, it needs salt or tavlin, or spices. So as we pointed out in class, what's Rashi clarifying for us here? Why do I need an example of tasting? I know what tasting food means. So we said, well, what's Rashi telling us here? Rashi seems to be teaching us that there's a limit in terms of what situation the tasting is allowed. Rashi is saying it's specifically in this situation, tasting food to see if it needs salt or spices. That's what the Gemara is asking when it says Mahu sheyatom. What's the halacha in terms of tasting? Implying that if I wanted to put the food in my mouth on purpose to benefit from it, that would not be allowed according to anybody. So again, Rashi is telling us here is that it's specifically in this situation the Gemara is asking about tasting, but in other situations the Gemara wouldn't even ask. The Gemara would never even think that I could put food in my mouth to see just for the enjoyment of tasting it on a fast day, probably because that's going to lead to eating. But if, let's say, I'm preparing food for after the fast, can I taste it to see if it needs a little bit of salt? That's what the Gemara is asking about. Again, limiting the chidush in the Gemara. So, as opposed to the Rashi that we just saw, where we had to read Rashi and try to figure out what's Rashi telling us, we're now going to see a comment from Tosfot, where Tosfot looks at the Gemara, and Tosfot tells us, here is what the Gemara is implying to us. The Tosfot, as you can see, is at the bottom of the page. Divrei HaMatchil is O Dilma Hanaki, discussing when the Gemara says, maybe the person accepted upon themselves not to benefit from the food, and therefore you wouldn't be allowed to taste. So Tosfot points out something very interesting about the Gemara. The Gemara doesn't say, is it that hana is not allowed, benefit is not allowed, and therefore this person would not be allowed to taste? Or is it that eating and drinking is not allowed, it's only eating and drinking that's not allowed, and therefore this person would be allowed to taste? The Gemara uses a very strange phrase, kiba allowed, accepted upon himself. Did this person accept upon themselves to eat or drink? So Tosfot says, Hai Lishna, this language, using these words, mashman, implies demari that we are discussing Tani Yachid, a voluntary fast, shekiba allowed, that he accepted upon himself. But this question would never even get off the ground when it comes to a mandatory fast. So we see Tosfot also limiting our Gemara, whereas Rashi limited our Gemara to say, oh no, we're only asking about a situation where you're tasting to see how whether the food needs salt, but not for your own pleasure. Tosfot is limiting this Gemara to specifically a Tanit Yachid. a voluntary fast. So specifically when there's a voluntary fast, that's what our Gemara is asking about. Aval Tanya Katuv, low, but not when it comes to a mandatory fast. When it comes to mandatory fast, nobody would think that you'd be allowed to taste food. How does Tosfot know that? Just making that up out of the blue? No, because the Gemara says, Kiba alad, did he accept? The Gemara frames the question in terms of what did he accept upon himself? Accepting upon yourself sounds like a voluntary fast day. So again, if we take the Gemara at face value, it's talking about all fast days and any type of tasting. Rashi seems to limit the tasting to for the sake of eating it, to see if it needs food, but not for the sake of benefit. And we figured the reason is because we don't want Rashi. Rashi would not want us tasting food. Rashi would think the Gemara would never allow us to taste food and then spit it out for tasting just for our benefit, because chances are we're going to end up swallowing it if that's our intention. Tosfot limits our application and our Gemara to a situation where it's a voluntary fast. When it comes to a mandatory fast, Hanira Katuv, he would say that it's never permitted, and there he's not using logic like Rashi is. He's using the actual words of the Gemara, which says Kibale, accepted upon himself, implying a voluntary fast. That is Unit 6. Okay, we're now going to go to Unit 7. I'm going to move pretty quickly through this one because it's almost 11 o'clock at night and I'm tired. And I'm in the middle of a pretty good movie. If anyone ever saw the movie Zodiac, so far so good. It's on Netflix. I recommend watching it. It's a little bit gruesome, a little bit suspenseful, but it seems pretty interesting. So I want to move through this so I can watch a little more of the movie and then get to sleep at a pretty normal hour. Probably won't finish the movie tonight, but I guess if I stop talking about this and I start teaching, then there's a better chance I can watch a little more. So here we go. This is our Unit 7 begins with the Mishnah. The Mishnah is very simple, very straightforward. Nashim avadim uktanim p'turin mikriyat shema. Women, servants, and children are p'turin, are exempt from the mitzvah of kriyat shema. We're going to the top of the next Amud, Chafam Bet, Umenat Tefillin. When it comes to Tefillin, that they're also exempt. Then what are they obligated? They're obligated in Tefillah, davening, mezuzah, mitzvah mezuzah, uberchat hamazon, and benching. So again, here our Mishnah tells us a few things that women are, in this case, women are p'turah from Kriyat Shema and Tefillin, and they're chayavot in mezuzah, birkat hamazon, and Tefillah. The Gemara is now going to analyze this statement of the Mishnah. And as we pointed out, this Mishnah has this Gemara has a very similar, as a pattern that repeats itself. Pshita ma'udetema kamash mulan. Pshita ma'udetema kamash mulan. Pshita ma'udetema kamash mulan. Pshita ma'udetema kamash mulan. Right? In all these cases, the Gemara is going to analyze why did the Mishnah have to tell me these things. Right? We know in general the Mishnah always tells us a chidush, something that's obvious, something we would not know otherwise. I'm sorry, that's not obvious. Sorry, let me go back. The Mishnah always tells us something that's a chidush, something we would not have known otherwise. Right? The Mishnah doesn't say you can't steal because we know that. The Mishnah doesn't say you can't kill. We know that. The Mishnah only tells us things we would not have known otherwise, a chidush. So whenever the Mishnah tells us something and it seems obvious, the Gemara will ask, Pshita, why are you telling me this? It's obvious. So in this case, the Gemara says we already know we have a rule. Women are p'turot from time-bound mitzvot, and they're chayavot in all other ones. So therefore, says the Gemara, let's look at the Mishnah. If the Mishnah tells us they're p'turot, and we're talking about a zman gram, a mitzvah that's time-bound, so we know that already. It's pashut. We know the rule that they're p'turot from time-bound mitzvot, so why do you have to tell me that again? If it's a mitzvah that is not time-bound, and it says chayav, they're chayavin, the women are chayavot, the women are obligated, why does the Mishnah need to tell me that? It's a regular mitzvah, it's not time-bound, and of course we know women are chayavot, so why do you have to tell me that? So now let's read through each one. And again, the Mishnah says, Pshita, isn't it obvious? The Gemara then says, Ma'u detema, what you might have thought, and then goes on to tell you an argument against this halacha. Now, we don't accept this argument, but since there is an argument to be made, it's not obvious that it's correct. And then the Gemara usually concludes, Kamash malan. Therefore, it comes to teach us, it's confirming that we were correct. Therefore, the Mishnah had to come and teach us the opposite is true, that in fact this rule is true, and this Ma'u detema argument is not correct. So let's read the first one. Kriyat Shema. When it comes to Kriyat Shema, Pshita, isn't that obvious that women are p'turot? Mitzvah Rashi says man grama, who it's a time-bound mitzvah. Chol mitzvah Rashi says man grama, nashim p'turot. Women are p'turot. So the Gemara answers no. Mahu detema, you might have thought. Here's the argument you could have made against this. Hoil, since it's it has in it malchut shamayim, it involves recognizing God as being your king. You might have thought that it's so important that we would say women are chayavot because it's so significant, even though it's time-bound. So that's the argument to say that maybe women are actually not p'turot from Kriyat Shema. Therefore, to tell us that they're p'turot is not obvious. The Gemara concludes, Kamash malan. Therefore, the Mishnah had to come to teach us that the opposite is true. Uminat tefillin, they're patur from tefillin. Again, pshita, isn't that obvious? The Gemara says no. Ma'u detema, you might have thought hoil since it kish lemezuzah, since we see that they are itkish, they are connected to mezuzah, that the mitzvah of tefillin is connected to mezuzah. And the same way that women are chayavot in mezuzah, they'd be chayavot in tefillin as well. Kamash Malad, it comes to teach us the opposite is true. Really, they are pturot. What is this connection? So if you look in the Torah, it's very clear. In Shema, the Torah says the following: you should teach all the things here. We're talking about Shema in terms of this interpretation. You should talk about them when you're on the way. When you're in your house, when you're on the way, when you're laying down. And now, what else should you do with Shema? Tie them on your arms. Put it on your eyes, between your eyes, meaning tefillin. And put it on your gates. So this is really all one commandment, right? Take Shema and tie it on your arm, put it on your head, and write it on your gates. So if we know that women are chayavot in putting it on your gates, you might have thought that this is also included, that they're also chayavot to put it on their arms and between their eyes. Therefore, the Mishnah had to come and tell us, no, that's not true. Actually, they are paturot. Moving back to the Gemara. Well, getting back to the Gemara, we're not actually going to read through the other two, but again, you see again, whoops, sorry about that. You see again, Pshita Ma'utema Kamash Malan. In this case, it's asking about mezuzah, right? Why would you think women are paturot? Right? When the Mishnah says that women are chayavot in mezuzah, the Gemara asks, isn't it obvious? Meaning, isn't it obvious they're chayavot in mezuzah because it's not Siman Gram, it's not time bound, so of course they're chayavot. Again, the Gemara again says, Ma'al here's what you might have thought, Kamashlan, therefore the opposite is true. Same thing when it comes to Birkat HaMazon. Birkat HaMazon, benching is not time bound, it has to do with when you finish eating. The Gemara answers again, Pshit, isn't that obvious? Isn't it obvious they're chayavot in Birkat HaMazon because it's not time bound? Ma'al here's what you might have thought, Kamashlan. Again, you really need to be able to, more important thing is to be able to recognize this pattern. But again, you do need to know that the reason why we thought that Kriyat Shema perhaps it's not obvious that they're paturot is because it's so important, because it has Malchut Shemayim, therefore Kamashman had to teach us the opposite is true. And when it came to Tefillin, you might think they were paturot because it's connected to Mezuzah and Kriyat Shema. I'm sorry, well, that's confusing. Let's not say it that way. Right? You might have thought that women are paturot from Tefillin because in the Torah, it puts Tefillin and Mezuzah together. In the same way they're chayavot and Mezuzah, they're chayavot and Tefillin. Therefore, that's what you might have thought. Therefore, Kamashman, the Mishnah had to come and tell us, no, the opposite is true. This is not true that we compare it to Mezuzah. In fact, women are paturot, and therefore it is actually a chidush. You wouldn't have known for sure that women are paturot from Tefillin had the Mishnah not told us this. Again, Pshitu, Ma'alutema, Kamashmalan, good luck studying, and good night.